The gunshot echoed through the marble hallway like thunder, and Aisha's scream tore from her throat as Ji-Won's body slammed against the wall. Blood bloomed across his white shirt, dark and terrifying, and for a split second the world stopped spinning. The masked men were closing in, their weapons raised, and Aisha knew with absolute certainty that if she didn't move right now, the man she'd sworn to hate would die right in front of her eyes. But let's rewind. Let's go back to the beginning, to the moment when Aisha Adeyemi's carefully planned life shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. 3 months earlier, Aisha stood in front of her cramped apartment mirror, adjusting the collar of her second-hand blazer. At 24, she'd graduated top of her class with a degree in international business, yet here she was, working double shifts at a cafe just to keep the lights on. Her reflection stared back at her with tired but determined eyes. She was her family's hope, their golden child, the one who would lift them all out of poverty. Her father had always told her that education was the key, that hard work would unlock every door. If only she'd known what doors were about to be blown wide open. That evening, Aisha returned home to find her father sitting in the dark. Mr. Adeyemi was a proud man, tall and strong despite his 58 years, but tonight his shoulders were hunched, his face buried in his hands. The sight made Aisha's stomach clench with fear. "Papa?" she called softly, switching on the light. "What's wrong?" He looked up and Aisha gasped. Her father's eyes were red and swollen, his face aged 10 years since she'd seen him that morning. He tried to smile, but it came out broken and wrong. "Nothing, my daughter. Just tired from work." But Aisha wasn't fooled. She'd noticed the changes over the past 6 months. The mysterious phone calls he'd take in hushed tones, disappearing into his room. The strange men who'd come to their door, speaking in languages she didn't understand. Her father's business, a small import company, had been struggling, but he'd always brushed off her concerns with reassuring words and forced smiles. "Papa, please," Aisha begged, kneeling beside his chair. "Tell me what's happening. Let me help you." "There's nothing you can do, Aisha. Nothing anyone can do." His voice cracked, and tears began streaming down his weathered face. "I've failed you. I've failed everyone." Before Aisha could respond, 3 sharp knocks thundered against their door. Her father's face drained of all color, and his hands began to shake violently. "No," he whispered. "Not yet. They said I had more time." The knocks came again, harder this time, making the hinges rattle. Aisha's heart hammered against her ribs as she moved toward the door, but her father grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "Don't open it," he pleaded desperately, but it was too late. The door burst open, and 3 men filled their small living room like dark shadows. They were all Korean, dressed in expensive black suits that seemed absurdly out of place in their modest apartment. The man in front was tall and lean, with a scar running down his left cheek and eyes as cold as winter steel. "Mr. Adeyemi," the scarred man said in accented English, his voice smooth and terrifying. "We've been patient, more patient than you deserve." "Please," Aisha's father stumbled to his feet, his voice breaking. "I just need another month. 1 more month and I can pay something. I'm trying, I swear I'm trying." "You've had 6 months," the man replied, examining his fingernails with casual indifference. 6 months past the original deadline. Mr. Kang is not a patient man, and his son is even less forgiving. Aisha stepped forward, her fear transforming into protective rage. "Who are you? What do you want from my father?" The scarred man's eyes slid to her, and a slow, calculating smile spread across his face. He studied her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, taking in every detail from her defiant expression to her clenched fists. "Ah," he said softly. "The daughter. Aisha, isn't it? Answer my question." Aisha demanded, though her voice trembled. "What does my father owe you?" $2 million, the man replied casually as if discussing the weather. "Plus interest. Your father borrowed from Chairman Kang to save his failing business. The business failed anyway. Now the debt must be paid." The number hit Aisha like a physical blow. $2 million. It might as well have been 2 billion. They could never pay that. They'd never even seen that much money. "We don't have it," Aisha whispered, the fight draining from her voice. "We can't possibly pay that." "We know." The scarred man stepped closer, and Aisha caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something darker, something dangerous. "That's why we've come with an alternative arrangement, one that your father agreed to when he first took the loan." Mr. Adeyemi made a strangled sound, shaking his head frantically. "No. Please no. We can find another way." "What arrangement?" Aisha asked, though every instinct screamed at her not to know. The scarred man pulled a photograph from his jacket and held it up. The image showed a young Korean man, probably in his late 20s, with sharp features and eyes that looked carved from black ice. He was devastatingly handsome in a dangerous, untouchable way that made Aisha's breath catch. "Ji-Won Kang," the man announced, "only son and heir to the Kang Empire. Your husband." The words didn't make sense at first. Aisha's brain refused to process them like they were spoken in a foreign language. "What?" "The contract your father signed included a clause," the scarred man explained with terrible patience. "If he couldn't repay the debt, his daughter would marry Ji-Won Kang. You will become part of the family. The debt will be forgiven." "That's insane," Aisha shouted, her voice rising to near hysteria. "This isn't the Middle Ages. You can't just trade people like property." "Papa, tell them." Aisha whirled on her father, desperate for him to deny it, to say there'd been some terrible mistake. But her father just stood there, tears streaming down his face, his silence confirming her worst nightmare. "You knew?" Aisha's voice came out barely above a whisper. "You knew this could happen, and you signed anyway?" "I never thought it would come to this," her father sobbed. "The business was going to succeed. I was sure of it. I never imagined I'd actually have to. Have to what? Sell your daughter?" The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. "How could you?" The scarred man cleared his throat impatiently. "Emotional reunions aside, we need an answer. Miss Adeyemi, you have 24 hours to prepare. A car will come for you tomorrow evening. You'll be taken to Seoul, where the wedding will take place in 1 week." "And if I refuse?" Aisha asked, though she already knew the answer from the way her father had crumpled, from the finality in the man's voice. The scarred man's smile widened, but his eyes remained dead and cold. "Then the debt will be collected another way. Your father will disappear. Your mother. Your younger siblings. One by one until the debt is paid in blood. These are the terms. These have always been the terms." After the men left, Aisha stood frozen in the middle of their living room, unable to cry, unable to scream, unable to feel anything but a vast, terrible emptiness. Her father tried to approach her, tried to explain, to apologize, but she held up her hand and walked to her room without a word. That night, Aisha lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling, her mind racing through impossible scenarios. She could run, but they'd find her. She could go to the police, but what could they do against an international crime syndicate? She could refuse and watch her entire family die because of her father's desperation and stupidity. In the end, there was no choice at all. There had never been a choice. The next evening, Aisha stood outside her apartment building with a single suitcase containing her entire life. Her mother had cried herself sick. Her siblings had begged her not to go, and her father had been unable to even look at her. A sleek black Mercedes pulled up, and the scarred man from yesterday emerged from the driver's seat. "Ready, Miss Adeyemi?" Does it matter? Aisha replied flatly. The drive to the airport passed in a blur. The private jet that waited on the tarmac looked like something from a movie, all leather seats and polished wood. Aisha sat by the window and watched her country disappear beneath the clouds, wondering if she'd ever see home again. Seoul was a shock to her senses. The city sprawled endlessly in all directions, a forest of glass and steel that made her feel impossibly small. The car that picked her up from the airport drove for what felt like hours before finally turning onto a private road that wound up into the hills. When the mansion came into view, Aisha's breath caught despite her determination to remain unmoved. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress. Walls at least 12 feet high surrounded the property, topped with cameras and what looked like razor wire. Armed guards stood at the gates, which opened smoothly as the car approached. The mansion itself was a sprawling, modern structure of white stone and dark glass, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Inside, Aisha was led through hallways that seemed to stretch forever, past rooms filled with art that probably cost more than her entire neighborhood. Finally, they stopped in front of a set of double doors. The scarred man knocked once, then pushed them open. The office beyond was huge, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights below. A massive desk dominated the space, and behind it sat a man who could only be Ji-Won Kang. He was in his 60s, with silver hair and a face carved from granite. His eyes were intelligent and utterly ruthless. "So," he said in perfect English, studying Aisha like she was a piece of furniture he was considering buying. "You're Adeyemi's daughter. I have a name," Aisha said, lifting her chin despite her fear. "It's Aisha." Something that might have been approval flickered across the chairman's face. "Spirit, good. You'll need it." Before Aisha could respond, a door on the other side of the office opened, and her breath caught in her throat. The man from the photograph stepped into the room, but the picture hadn't captured the full effect of him. Ji-Won Kang moved with the fluid grace of a predator, every step deliberate and controlled. He was tall, probably 6 feet, dressed in an all-black suit that emphasized his lean, muscular build. His face was beautiful in a sharp, dangerous way, with high cheekbones and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. But it was his eyes that truly frightened Aisha. They were dark and endless, holding depths of coldness that made her shiver. Those eyes swept over her briefly, dismissively, before turning to his father. "This is her?" "Show some respect, Ji-Won," the chairman said mildly. "This is your future wife." "My future obligation," Ji-Won corrected, his voice low and smooth and absolutely devoid of warmth. "Let's not pretend this is anything more than a business arrangement." He finally looked directly at Aisha, and she felt pinned by that gaze like a butterfly on a board. "I didn't ask for a wife. I don't want a wife. But my father made a deal with yours, and I honor my family's agreements. We'll marry in 1 week. You'll live here under my protection. You'll obey the rules. In exchange, your father's debt is forgiven, and your family stays alive. Understand?" Aisha's hands clenched into fists. "I understand that I'm being treated like property. I understand that neither of you care what I want." For the first time, something flickered in Ji-Won's eyes. Interest, maybe, or surprise. "What you want is irrelevant. This is your reality now. I suggest you accept it." The week before the wedding passed in a haze of confusion and fear. Aisha was given a bedroom that was larger than her entire apartment back home, with a private bathroom and a closet already filled with expensive clothes in her exact size. It should have been a dream, but it felt like a beautiful prison. She rarely saw Ji-Won, who seemed to spend most of his time in parts of the mansion she wasn't allowed to enter. When they did cross paths, he barely acknowledged her existence beyond a curt nod. The servants were polite but distant, clearly afraid of their employer. Aisha spent her days exploring the parts of the mansion she was permitted to see, and her nights crying into her pillow, mourning the life she'd lost. The wedding day arrived with gray skies and cold wind. There was no white dress, no flowers, no music. Just Aisha in a simple ivory gown standing in the chairman's office with Ji-Won beside her in a black suit. A judge read out words in Korean that Aisha didn't understand. She signed papers with trembling hands, watching her name appear next to Ji-Won's in permanent ink. When it was done, Ji-Won didn't kiss her. He didn't even look at her. He simply walked out of the room, leaving Aisha standing there feeling more alone than she'd ever felt in her life. "Welcome to the family," Chairman Kang said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Life as Ji-Won's wife was strange and suffocating. He gave her a list of rules on their wedding night, delivered in that same cold, emotionless tone. She wasn't to leave the mansion without permission and an armed escort. She wasn't to enter his office, his bedroom, or the entire east wing of the house. She wasn't to ask questions about his business. She was to learn Korean, learn to behave appropriately, and stay out of his way. "Do you understand?" he asked when he finished. "Perfectly," Aisha replied, her voice dripping with bitterness. "I'm to be a silent, obedient decoration." "You're to be smart enough to stay alive," Ji-Won corrected sharply. "This world is dangerous, Aisha. There are people who would use you to get to me, who would hurt you just to send me a message. These rules aren't about control. They're about protection." "Protection?" Aisha laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call kidnapping me and forcing me into marriage?" Ji-Won's jaw tightened, and for a moment, something almost like guilt flashed across his face. But it was gone so quickly that Aisha thought she'd imagined it. "Good night," he said curtly, and left her alone in her bedroom. Days turned into weeks, and Aisha settled into a strange routine. She took Korean lessons from a tutor 3 times a week. She explored the mansion's library, which was extensive and impressive. She ate meals alone in her room because Ji-Won was always too busy to join her. The loneliness was crushing, but pride kept her from showing it. Then small things started happening. Things that didn't match Ji-Won's cold indifference. One evening, Aisha fell asleep on the couch in the living room while reading. She woke up hours later to find a blanket draped over her and the book carefully marked at her page. Another time, she mentioned casually to a servant that she missed African food, and the next day, the chef prepared a perfect jollof rice. When she asked who had requested it, the chef just smiled mysteriously. Most telling was the night Aisha couldn't sleep and wandered down to the kitchen at 2 in the morning. She found Ji-Won there, still dressed in his work clothes, drinking coffee and reviewing documents. He looked up when she entered, and for a long moment they just stared at each other. "Can't sleep?" he asked finally. "No," Aisha admitted. "Too many thoughts." Ji-Won nodded slowly, then pushed a chair out with his foot. "Sit." She did, warily, and he poured her a cup of coffee without asking. They sat in silence for several minutes before Aisha found the courage to speak. "Why do you do that?" she asked. "Do what?" "Pretend you don't care, but then do small things. The blanket, the food, the coffee." She gestured at the cup in her hands. Ji-Won's expression remained unreadable, but his fingers tightened slightly on his own cup. "I don't pretend anything." "So you do care?" "I care about fulfilling my obligations," he replied carefully. "You're my wife. That makes you my responsibility." "Is that all I am?" Aisha challenged. "An obligation." Ji-Won met her eyes, and for just a second his mask slipped. Aisha saw something raw and complicated there, something that looked almost like longing, but then it was gone, hidden behind cold indifference again. "What else would you be?" he asked quietly, and left the kitchen without waiting for an answer. Everything changed the night Aisha broke the rules. She'd been living in the mansion for almost 2 months, and her curiosity had grown unbearable. The East Wing was forbidden, but she'd noticed Ji-Won spending long hours there, often emerging looking exhausted and troubled. She told herself she just wanted to understand the man she'd been forced to marry, to see what drove him, what made him so cold. The truth was, Aisha was starting to feel things she didn't want to feel. She noticed the way Ji-Won's hair fell across his forehead when he was tired. The rare moments when his lips almost curved into a smile at something unexpected. The protective way he positioned himself between her and strangers when they had to leave the mansion. She was falling for her captor, and it terrified her. So one night, when Ji-Won was away on business, Aisha snuck into the East Wing. She found his office easily enough, a large room filled with computers and file cabinets. The documents on his desk were in Korean, but she recognized enough to understand what she was seeing. Shipping routes, financial records for shell companies, photographs of men with targets marked over their faces. This wasn't just a wealthy family with questionable business practices. This was organized crime on an international scale. Ji-Won wasn't just the son of a Mafia boss. He was actively involved, making decisions that affected lives all over the world. "What are you doing?" Aisha spun around so fast she knocked over a stack of files. Ji-Won stood in the doorway, and the expression on his face made her blood run cold. She'd never seen him angry before. He'd been distant, cold, controlled. But now rage burned in his eyes, raw and terrifying. "I told you," he said, his voice deadly quiet as he advanced on her. "I specifically told you never to come here." "I just wanted to understand," Aisha stammered, backing away until she hit the desk. "I wanted to know who you really are." "Who I am?" Ji-Won laughed, but it was a harsh, broken sound. "You want to know who I am? I'm a killer, Aisha. I'm the man my father trained to take over an empire built on blood and fear. I've done things that would give you nightmares. That's why I kept you away. That's why I stayed cold." He was close now, close enough that Aisha could see the pain in his eyes beneath the anger. "Do you know how many enemies I have? Do you know what they would do if they knew I had a weakness? If they knew He cut himself off abruptly, but the almost confession hung in the air between them. "Knew you what?" Aisha whispered. Ji-Won's hands came up to grip her shoulders, not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to make his point. "If they knew I was starting to care, if they knew that every time I see you it gets harder to maintain distance, if they knew that I spend my nights thinking about you instead of business. That's why I need you to follow the rules, Aisha. Not to control you, but to keep you alive." The confession stunned them both into silence. Ji-Won's eyes widened slightly, as if he couldn't believe he'd said the words out loud. Aisha's heart hammered against her ribs, hope and fear warring in her chest. "You care about me?" she asked, hardly daring to believe it. Ji-Won's jaw clenched. "I care about keeping you safe. That's all you need to know." But it wasn't all. Aisha could see it in his eyes, feel it in the way his hands trembled slightly against her shoulders. He cared. Maybe more than he wanted to admit, even to himself. "Then stop pushing me away," Aisha said boldly, reaching up to touch his face. "Stop treating me like an obligation. I see you, Ji-Won. I see past the coldness to the man underneath." For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. His gaze dropped to her lips, and he leaned in slightly. But then he jerked back, releasing her shoulders and putting several feet of distance between them. "Get out," he said roughly. "Go back to your room. And Aisha, don't come here again." She fled, tears streaming down her face, but something had fundamentally shifted between them. The wall was cracking, and they both knew it. After that night, Ji-Won couldn't seem to maintain his distance anymore. He started joining her for dinner, sitting across from her at the long table and making stilted conversation about her day, her Korean lessons, books she was reading. He taught her conversational phrases, correcting her pronunciation with a patience she'd never seen from him before. Once, she made a joke in broken Korean, and he laughed. Actually laughed, the sound rich and genuine and so beautiful it made her chest ache. Slowly, painfully, Ji-Won began opening up. He told her about his childhood, about a mother who'd died when he was 10, and a father who'd shown love through brutal training and impossible expectations. He explained that he'd never wanted this life, but he'd been born into it with no choice, much like she'd been forced into their marriage. "I used to dream about being normal," he admitted one night as they sat in the garden under the stars. "About having a regular job, a simple life. But that was never going to be possible." "It's not too late," Aisha said gently. "You could walk away." Ji-Won smiled sadly. "No one walks away from this life, Aisha. You either die in it, or you die trying to leave it." The darkness of his words frightened her, but she couldn't stop her heart from responding to his vulnerability. She was falling in love with him, completely and helplessly, and the realization both thrilled and terrified her. Then came the night that changed everything. Ji-Won had a meeting downtown, something he said would only take an hour. Aisha was in the library when she heard the explosion. The windows rattled, and alarms began blaring throughout the mansion. Servants ran past in panic, and Aisha's heart seized with pure terror. She ran toward the garage just as a car screeched up the driveway, tires smoking. The driver's side door opened, and Aisha screamed. Ji-Won stumbled out, blood streaming from a wound on his head, his white shirt soaked red. 2 more cars roared up behind him, filled with armed men. Without thinking, Aisha ran forward. She grabbed Ji-Won as he started to fall, taking his weight despite him being much larger. Bullets cracked through the air, and she heard Ji-Won shout something in Korean, but her mind had gone blank with terror. "The car," Ji-Won gasped, pushing her toward his vehicle. "Drive. I can't leave you. Drive," he roared, and something in his tone snapped her into action. Aisha half dragged, half carried him to the passenger seat, dodging bullets that sparked off the driveway. She threw herself into the driver's seat, turned the key, and slammed her foot on the gas. The mansion's security team engaged with the attackers behind them, and Ji-Won shouted directions through gritted teeth, guiding her to a safe house she didn't even know existed. They made it inside just as Ji-Won collapsed. Aisha caught him, lowering him to the floor, her hands shaking violently as she tried to assess his wounds. He'd been shot in the shoulder and grazed along the ribs. Blood was everywhere, sticky and hot and terrifying. "I need to call a doctor," Aisha said frantically, looking for a phone. "No," Ji-Won grabbed her wrist weakly. "No doctors, too dangerous. First aid kit. Bathroom." Aisha found the kit and returned to find Ji-Won had managed to sit up, leaning against the wall. His face was pale, his breathing labored, but his eyes were focused on her with an intensity that made her hands shake worse. "You saved my life," he said hoarsely. "You could have run. Should have run. I wasn't going to let you die," Aisha replied, carefully cutting away his shirt to expose the bullet wound. "Not after finally getting you to open up." Ji-Won made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "Why would you risk yourself for me, after everything I've done to you?" Aisha's hands stilled, and she looked up to meet his gaze. In his eyes she saw fear and pain, and something else, something that made her heart skip beats. "Because somewhere along the way," she whispered, "I stopped being your prisoner and started being your partner. Because when I thought you might die, I realized I love you." Ji-Won's good hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Aisha." "Don't," she said quickly. "Don't say anything you don't mean. I know you didn't want this. I know I was forced on you, but I can't help what I feel." "You think I don't feel it too?" Ji-Won asked roughly, pulling her closer despite his injuries. "You think I've been fighting this for my health? I've been trying to protect you from this world, from me. But God help me, I'm done fighting." He kissed her then, one hand tangled in her hair, and Aisha forgot about the blood, the danger, everything except the feeling of his lips on hers, fierce and desperate and full of everything they'd been holding back. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ji-Won rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he breathed. "I think I've loved you since that first night when you stood in my father's office and refused to be intimidated. I've been terrified of it, terrified of what it makes me vulnerable to. But I love you, Aisha." "Then stop protecting me from yourself," Aisha said fiercely. "Let me in. Let me help you." "This life," Ji-Won shook his head. "It's dangerous, dark. I don't want to drag you deeper into it. I'm already in it," Aisha reminded him. "The moment I married you, I became part of this world. You can't shield me from reality, Ji-Won, but we can face it together." After she'd patched his wounds as best she could, they stayed on the safe house floor for hours, talking in whispers about everything. Ji-Won explained that the attack had been orchestrated by his uncle, who wanted to take over the Kang Empire and saw Ji-Won as the only obstacle. His uncle had been working behind the scenes for months, building alliances and waiting for the right moment to strike. "He'll come after me again," Ji-Won said grimly. "And now that he knows I care about you, he'll come after you too." "Huh. Then we stop him first," Aisha said with more confidence than she felt. "We?" Ji-Won raised an eyebrow. "We," Aisha confirmed. "I told you. We're partners now." Over the next few days, everything accelerated. Ji-Won brought Aisha into his inner circle, teaching her about his operations and the delicate balance of power that kept his family's empire running. She learned that beneath the violence and crime, there were also legitimate businesses, families who depended on the Kang Empire for protection and livelihoods. It wasn't black and white. Nothing was. Ji-Won's uncle made his move 2 weeks later. Aisha was shopping in the city with her security detail when 3 SUVs boxed them in. Men poured out, armed with automatic weapons, and her guards were overpowered in seconds. Aisha fought, screaming and kicking, but they drugged her with something that made the world go fuzzy and dark. She woke in a warehouse, tied to a chair. Her head pounded, and her mouth was dry as sand. Across from her sat Ji-Won's uncle, a man who looked remarkably like Chairman Kang, but with crueler eyes. "Awake?" he asked pleasantly in English. "Good. I was worried we'd given you too much. That would have ruined the fun." "What do you want?" Aisha croaked. "What everyone wants. Power. Control." He stood and circled her slowly. Ji-Won was always too soft, too concerned with honor and loyalty. He was never going to be the leader we need, but he won't step aside. So I'll take what should be mine by removing his weaknesses, starting with you. Fear clawed at Aisha's throat, but she forced herself to breathe slowly. "He'll come for me." "Oh, I'm counting on it." The uncle smiled. "I've made sure he knows exactly where you are. He'll come rushing in like a knight in shining armor, and my men will be waiting. 2 problems solved at once." Aisha's mind raced. She needed to warn Ji-Won somehow, but her phone was gone and her hands were bound too tightly to escape. All she could do was pray that Ji-Won would see the trap for what it was. But then she heard it. Gunfire. Shouts. The warehouse doors exploded inward and Ji-Won stormed through like an avenging angel. He moved with lethal precision, taking down men 3 times his size with brutal efficiency. Aisha had never seen this side of him, the true warrior that his father had trained him to be, and it was both terrifying and magnificent. The uncle pulled a gun, pointing it at Aisha's head. "One more step, nephew, and she dies." Ji-Won froze, his own weapon raised. His eyes met Aisha's across the warehouse, and in them she saw love and fear and desperate determination. "Let her go," Ji-Won said, his voice deadly calm. "This is between us." "Everything changed when you chose her over the family," the uncle spat. "You brought her into this world. Her blood is on your hands." It happened so fast. The uncle's finger tightened on the trigger, but Aisha threw her weight sideways, chair and all. The shot went wide, and Ji-Won's didn't. The uncle fell, and then Ji-Won was running toward her, cutting her bonds, pulling her into his arms so tightly she could barely breathe. "I thought I'd lost you," he said brokenly, his face buried in her hair. "When they called and told me they had you, I thought, I'm okay." Aisha soothed, even though she was shaking. "I'm okay. You found me. I'll always find you," Ji-Won promised fiercely. "Always." But the danger wasn't over. When they returned to the mansion, Chairman Kang was waiting. The old man looked at Ji-Won with an expression Aisha had never seen before. Disappointment? Anger? It was hard to tell. "You killed your uncle for a woman," the chairman said flatly. "I killed a traitor who tried to destroy this family," Ji-Won corrected. "And yes, I did it to protect my wife. Is that a problem, father?" The chairman's eyes flicked to Aisha, then back to his son. "This marriage was meant to be a simple business arrangement, nothing more. The girl has become a distraction, a liability. The agreement can be dissolved. Send her back to her family." "No." Ji-Won's voice was absolute. "No?" The chairman raised an eyebrow. "I gave you an order, and I'm refusing it." Ji-Won straightened to his full height, and Aisha saw him transform before her eyes. This wasn't the cold, controlled man she'd first met, or the vulnerable, conflicted person he'd become. This was a leader, someone willing to stand up to his father for what he believed in. "I love her, father. She stays. And if that's a problem for you, then perhaps it's time for me to take over the family business officially." The silence that followed was deafening. Chairman Kang stared at his son for a long moment, and Aisha held her breath, waiting for an explosion. But then the old man smiled. Actually smiled. "About time," he said gruffly. "I was beginning to think you'd never find your spine. The business is yours, Ji-Won. Try not to run it into the ground with your sentiment." And just like that, everything changed. Ji-Won took control of the Kang Empire, and true to his word, he did things differently. Less violence, more legitimate business. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't clean, but it was better. Aisha stood beside him through all of it, no longer a prisoner or an obligation, but a true partner in every sense. 6 months later, they stood on the balcony of their bedroom, looking out over Seoul's glittering lights. Aisha leaned back against Ji-Won's chest, his arms wrapped around her waist, and felt truly at peace for the first time since her life had been turned upside down. "Do you ever regret it?" Ji-Won asked quietly. "Being forced into this life, into marriage with me?" Aisha turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to cup his face. "I regret how it started," she said honestly. "I regret the fear and the pain and feeling like I had no choice. But I don't regret where we ended up. I don't regret falling in love with you. Even knowing what I am, what I've done." Ji-Won's voice held the faint echo of old guilt. "You're more than your worst moments," Aisha said firmly. "You're the man who covers me with blankets when I fall asleep reading. The man who learned to cook jollof rice just to make me smile. The man who risked everything to save me. That's who you are, Ji-Won. Not just the heir to a Mafia empire, but a person capable of love and change and hope." Ji-Won kissed her softly, a kiss full of promise and gratitude. I never believed in fate, he murmured against her lips. But maybe I was meant to meet you. Maybe all the darkness in my life was leading to you. Maybe we were meant to save each other, Aisha suggested. Below them, the city continued its endless rhythm, millions of lives intersecting and diverging in patterns too complex to predict. Somewhere in that vast tapestry, Aisha's family was living their lives, the debt forgiven, their safety guaranteed. Somewhere, other young women were making impossible choices, facing uncertain futures. Life continued, messy and complicated and beautiful. But here, on this balcony, wrapped in the arms of the man she'd been forced to marry and had chosen to love, Aisha finally understood something fundamental. Love didn't ask for permission. It didn't wait for the perfect moment or the ideal circumstances. It found you in the darkest places, in the most unexpected ways, and it transformed everything. The next morning, Aisha woke to find Ji-Won already dressed, standing by the window with his phone pressed to his ear. He spoke in rapid Korean, his tone sharp and businesslike, and she recognized the stance. Something was happening, something that required his attention as the head of the family. When he ended the call, she sat up. "What's wrong?" Ji-Won turned and she saw the conflict in his eyes. "One of our shipping operations in Busan was raided last night. The cargo was seized, 3 of our men arrested." "Police?" Aisha asked, though she was already pulling on a robe and moving toward him. "Worse. Federal agents. Someone tipped them off." Ji-Won's jaw clenched. "There's a traitor in our organization." Over the next few weeks, Aisha saw a side of Ji-Won's world she'd been shielded from before. She sat in on meetings where hard decisions were made, where loyalty was tested, and consequences were dealt. It was brutal and often frightening, but Ji-Won never shut her out. He valued her perspective, her outsider's view of situations that others were too close to see clearly. "You think like someone who isn't afraid of challenging the system," he told her one night after a particularly difficult meeting. "Everyone else has been raised in this world. They accept certain things as unchangeable, but you question everything, and sometimes those questions lead to better solutions, or they just annoy people," Aisha said dryly, remembering the hostile looks from some of the older family members during that day's discussion. "They need to be annoyed," Ji-Won replied firmly. "Change is uncomfortable, but it's necessary." They eventually discovered the traitor, one of the chairman's old associates who'd been feeding information to the authorities in exchange for immunity. The revelation sent shockwaves through the organization, forcing Ji-Won to make hard choices about who to trust and how to restructure their operations. Through it all, Aisha remained his constant. She learned more Korean, becoming fluent enough to follow most conversations. She built relationships with the other women in the family, the wives and daughters who navigated this dangerous world with grace and strength. She discovered she had a talent for negotiation, for finding diplomatic solutions to conflicts that might otherwise have turned violent. But there were hard days, too. Days when Ji-Won came home with blood on his hands, literally or figuratively, and Aisha had to reconcile the man she loved with the things he had to do to survive in his world. Days when she missed her family with an ache that felt physical, when she longed for the simple life she'd lost. On one particularly difficult night, after Ji-Won had been forced to make a decision that cost lives, Aisha found him in his office at 3 a.m, staring at nothing. "Talk to me," she said softly, entering without permission and closing the door behind her. "I ordered the execution of 2 men today," Ji-Won said flatly. "They betrayed the family, sold information that got innocent people killed. By our laws, by the code I inherited, death was the only appropriate response." "But," Aisha prompted, sitting beside him, "but they had families, children. And now those children are without fathers, and it's my fault." His voice cracked slightly. I wanted to do things differently, to be better than my father. But maybe there is no better in this world. Maybe violence is all we understand. Aisha took his hands in hers, forcing him to look at her. You're not your father. Yes, you made a hard choice today, but you made it to protect others, to maintain the order that keeps hundreds of families safe. That's the burden of leadership, Ji-Won. Sometimes there are no good choices, only necessary ones. How do you live with that? He asked desperately. How do you love someone who does these things? Because I know who you are beneath the decisions, Aisha said firmly. I know you agonize over every choice. I know you're trying to build something better, even when the path is unclear. And I know that you're not doing this out of cruelty or greed, but out of duty and responsibility. That matters, Ji-Won. Your heart matters. He pulled her into his arms then, holding her so tightly it almost hurt. And she felt the tremors running through his body. This strong, powerful man was breaking in her arms, and all she could do was hold him together and whisper that everything would be okay, even when she wasn't sure it would be. Time passed, and seasons changed. Aisha's first year as Mrs. Kang flew by in a whirlwind of challenges and changes. She became a true partner to Ji-Won, not just in name but in practice. When he had to travel for business, she often went with him. When decisions needed to be made, he consulted her. When the weight of leadership became too heavy, she was there to share the burden. Their relationship deepened in ways Aisha had never imagined possible. They learned each other's languages, literally and figuratively. Ji-Won discovered that Aisha processed stress through cooking, and he started joining her in the kitchen, chopping vegetables while she narrated stories from her childhood. Aisha learned that Ji-Won needed silence after difficult days, just her presence in the same room while he worked through his thoughts. They fought sometimes, passionate arguments that left them both exhausted. But they always came back together, always talked through their differences, always chose each other in the end. The foundation of their relationship, built on such rocky ground, had somehow become unshakable. One evening, almost 18 months after their forced marriage, Aisha stood in the bathroom staring at a positive pregnancy test. Her hands shook as she looked at the 2 pink lines, emotions crashing through her in waves, joy, terror, hope, fear, all tangled together until she couldn't separate them. She found Ji-Won in his office, reviewing reports. He looked up when she entered, and whatever he saw in her face made him immediately stand, concern flooding his features. "What's wrong?" Aisha couldn't speak. She just held out the test, watching as comprehension dawned on his face. For a long moment, Ji-Won just stared at the small plastic stick, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at her, and she saw tears shining in his eyes. "We're going to have a baby?" His voice was barely a whisper. Aisha nodded, her own tears spilling over. "Are you happy?" "Scared? I don't know what to feel." Ji-Won crossed to her in 2 strides, dropping to his knees and pressing his face against her still flat stomach. "Both," he said, his voice muffled, terrified, thrilled, overwhelmed. He looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. "A baby, Aisha. Our baby." "Our baby," she repeated, running her fingers through his hair. "Ji-Won, I'm scared. This world, your enemies, I'll protect you both," he said fiercely, standing and pulling her close. "I'll protect you with everything I have. And by the time our child is old enough to understand, I promise you, I'll have made this world safer. I'll have built something better." It was a promise he worked tirelessly to keep. Over the following months, as Aisha's belly grew, Ji-Won accelerated his efforts to legitimize the family business. He cut ties with the most violent operations, invested heavily in legal enterprises, and began building bridges with law enforcement rather than bribing them into silence. It wasn't easy. There was pushback from the old guard, resistance from those who profited from the criminal activities. But Ji-Won was relentless, and with Aisha's support and strategic thinking, they slowly reshaped the Kang Empire into something that could stand in the light. Chairman Kang watched these changes with an inscrutable expression, occasionally offering advice, but mostly staying out of his son's way. One afternoon, he summoned Aisha to his study, and she went nervously, unsure what the old man wanted. "Sit," he commanded, and she did, folding her hands over her pregnant belly. For a long moment, the chairman just studied her. Then he said, "I chose you for my son because your father owed a debt." It was supposed to be a simple transaction, nothing more. Aisha's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. "I was wrong," the chairman continued, surprising her. "Or perhaps I was more right than I knew. You weren't just payment for a debt, Aisha. You were exactly what Ji-Won needed. Someone strong enough to stand beside him, wise enough to guide him, and brave enough to challenge him. You've made him a better leader than I ever could have. He was always capable of being that leader," Aisha said quietly. "He just needed permission to be himself." The chairman smiled, a real smile this time. "My grandson or granddaughter is lucky to have you as a mother. This family is lucky to have you, period. I want you to know that." It was the closest thing to an apology or acknowledgement Aisha had ever received from the old man, and it meant more than she'd expected. "Thank you," she said softly. When their daughter was born on a warm spring morning, Ji-Won held her with tears streaming down his face, counting her tiny fingers and toes, as if he couldn't believe she was real. They named her Hope, because that's what she represented. Hope for a better future, hope for redemption, hope that love could triumph even in the darkest circumstances. Watching Ji-Won with their daughter, seeing the tenderness and wonder in his eyes, Aisha's heart overflowed. This man who'd been trained as a weapon, raised to be cold and ruthless, was cradling their baby girl like she was made of spun glass, whispering promises of protection and love in Korean and English. "I never knew," he said, looking up at Aisha with wonder. "I never knew I could feel like this, like my heart exists outside my body." "Welcome to parenthood," Aisha said with a tired laugh. As hope grew, the mansion transformed. Baby toys appeared in previously pristine rooms. Laughter echoed through hallways that had only known tension and formality. Ji-Won, the feared Mafia heir, could be found on his hands and knees playing peekaboo. His business, meetings interrupted by his daughter's delighted giggles over the baby monitor. The changes in Ji-Won rippled outward, affecting how he led the family business. He became more concerned with long-term stability than short-term profits, more focused on building legacy than maintaining fear. Under his leadership, the Kang Empire evolved, slowly but surely, into something that Hope could one day inherit without shame. 2 years after Hope's birth, on the anniversary of their wedding, Ji-Won surprised Aisha with a renewal of vows. But this time, it was different. This time, there were flowers and music and both their families present. Aisha's parents had flown in from Africa, tears of joy streaming down their faces as they witnessed their daughter marry the man she'd grown to love. As they stood before their friends and family, Ji-Won took Aisha's hands and spoke from his heart. No script, no formality. "5 years ago, you were forced to marry me. You had no choice, no say in the matter. It's a beginning I'll always regret, even as I'm grateful for where it led us." His voice was thick with emotion. "But today, I'm asking you to choose me, not because you have to, but because you want to. Aisha, will you marry me again? Will you choose this life, this love, this future we're building together?" Aisha's tears flowed freely as she squeezed his hands. "I've been choosing you every day for years now, Ji-Won. But yes, I'll marry you again. I'll choose you today and tomorrow and every day after. Because what started as obligation became the greatest love of my life. When they kissed, their daughter squealed with delight from her grandfather's arms, and everyone laughed through their tears. It was messy and emotional and perfect, nothing like their first cold, obligatory ceremony. This was real. This was chosen. This was love. That night, as they lay in bed with Hope sleeping peacefully in her nursery down the hall, Aisha reflected on the strange journey that had brought them here. From prisoner to partner, from obligation to love, from despair to hope. It hadn't been easy. There had been blood and tears and moments when she'd wondered if they would survive. But they had survived. More than that, they'd thrived, building something beautiful from the darkest of beginnings. "What are you thinking about?" Ji-Won asked, pulling her closer. "About how strange life is," Aisha replied. "How the worst thing that ever happened to me led to the best thing. How being forced into marriage with you became the greatest blessing of my life. Fate is funny that way," Ji-Won mused, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Do you believe in fate now?" Aisha asked, remembering his earlier claim that he didn't. "I believe in us," Ji-Won said simply. "Whether it was fate or chance or just blind luck that brought you to me, I'm grateful. Every day, Aisha. Every single day, I'm grateful you're mine." "And you're mine," Aisha whispered back. Outside their window, Seoul glittered in the darkness, millions of lights representing millions of lives. Somewhere in that vast city, other people were facing impossible choices, navigating complicated circumstances, struggling to find love and meaning in a chaotic world. Life continued in all its messy, complicated glory. But here, in this room, wrapped in the arms of the man she'd been forced to marry and had chosen to love, Aisha finally understood the truth that had eluded her for so long. Love didn't need perfect circumstances. It didn't require ideal beginnings or guaranteed happy endings. It simply needed two people willing to choose each other again and again, through all the darkness and light life threw their way. And that's exactly what they did. Every single day, in ways big and small, Aisha and Ji-Won chose each other. They chose love over fear, hope over despair, forgiveness over resentment. They chose to build something better, not just for themselves, but for their daughter and all the generations that would come after. Years later, when Hope asked about how her parents met, they told her the truth. Not a sanitized fairy tale, but the real story, complicated and messy and ultimately beautiful. They told her about forced vows and hidden hearts, about fear transforming into love, about choosing each other even when the world made it hard. "So you didn't love each other at first?" Hope asked, her young face serious. "No," Aisha admitted. "At first I was angry and scared. Your father was cold and distant, but somewhere along the way we saw each other, really saw each other. And we fell in love." "The best love stories aren't always the easiest ones," Ji-Won added, ruffling his daughter's hair. "Sometimes the greatest love comes from the hardest beginnings." Hope considered this seriously, then smiled. "I think it's the best love story ever." And maybe she was right, because their story, with all its darkness and complexity, had ultimately been about two people finding light in each other. About transformation and redemption and the courage to love even when it seemed impossible. If someone had told Aisha, that terrified young woman being forced into a car 5 years ago, that she would someday stand beside Ji-Won as his equal partner, that she would love him with her whole heart and build a family with him, she would have thought them insane. But life doesn't ask for permission. Love doesn't wait for the perfect moment, and sometimes the most beautiful stories begin in the darkest places, written by two people brave enough to choose each other against all odds. As Aisha watched her husband play with their daughter in the evening light, she smiled. Their story hadn't been conventional or easy, but it was theirs. Built on forced vows and hidden hearts, it had grown into something neither of them could have imagined that cold wedding day. And it was perfect, in all its complicated, messy, beautiful truth. The end.